Well, hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Michael Scott and I'm speaking to you from Oxford in the UK. And Sanford J. Unger will be speaking to you in a moment from Washington, DC. And this is a jointly promoted event between the Future of Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University, the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity, Blackfriars Hall, the University of Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and politics in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished panel and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. Starting from now, you can type in your questions by using the QA key at the bottom of your screen. These will come to me during the session and I will try to sort them into some kind of logical order and put as many of them as possible to the panel for consideration. We urge you please to keep your questions as short as you can, but to keep them flowing. If time doesn't allow for your question to be answered today, an appropriate panel member will try to answer it by email. So thank you for joining us for what I hope will not be a weary session, but a very lively session, and I'm sure it will be. You are one of over 250 from around the world who've registered for the event. So over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be, to everyone who's joining us. Delighted. This is the fourth in our series of international dialogues, really, co-sponsored by Blackfriars Hall at Oxford and the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University. Our topic today, as you know, is women's voices in a weary world, and we will try to cover as much of that subject as we possibly can. Just briefly, we've previously circulated bios of all our distinguished panelists, but we have with us Rosie Campbell from King's College London, who's done a great deal in studying the role of women in many different fields in the world today. Baroness Mary Gowdy from the British House of Lords, a human rights activist, formerly a Labour Party stalwart, and someone who has a lot to say about the role of women in politics. Joining us from outside of Boston at Wellesley College is Paula Johnson, a cardiologist, former head of the Boston Public Health Commission, and now president of Wellesley, and which is, for those who don't know, a very distinguished and important women's college, still a women's college in the United States. And an old friend and colleague of mine, Nina Sutton from Paris. We're calling her a Franco-British journalist. She has been active in France and Britain and the United States, wrote the first book in French about Watergate quite a few years ago, and has worked for many significant French publications. I'd like to start with you, Rosie, asking you for a 30,000-foot overview to get us started. Are women's voices being heard and listened to in what most of us concede or assess as a time of pretty great crisis and chaos on the international scene?
I think the simple answer to that is unfortunately not. We've done some work at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College looking at media coverage of the COVID-19 crisis in the UK, Australia, and the United States, and shown that women's voices are very much disproportionately unheard. So it varies by sector, but actually when it comes even to scientific opinion, where we know that women have been at the forefront of some of the vaccines, for example, women have been less heard in the public debate. And that is at the kind of the top level. But actually, as we look around the world and we look at policies that are being made to try and mitigate the impacts of COVID-19, we can see that actually women's lives have been disproportionately hurt by the economic impacts. But some of that is because the policymakers have not got the right women in the room. We know that around the world, very troublingly, that girls are exiting education and starting to get married younger again because of the financial implications. There's a lot of activity globally this year to try and do something about this. The UN has got the Generation Equality Forum, and there's a lot of activity and a lot of work to try and raise women's voices, but they are still relatively marginalized compared to men's.
Paula Johnson, I wanted to ask you about how the picture looks in science, medicine, public health. One could get the impression that there's been an improvement in the role of women in these fields, or at least the recognition of the role of women. Women have long had a greater role than was apparent to the public. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think that the, building on Rosie's, I think, very accurate opening, that there's been progress. But I think as we look at this current time, that what we are seeing is really a step backward. If we look at the early phase of the pandemic, for example, data were not stratified by gender, and they surely weren't stratified by the intersection of gender and race and ethnicity, which in the United States was critically important to understanding the pandemic. So for all the years that we've really focused on how to proceed with science accurately, how to measure accurately, how to do research accurately, we still fell back to old habits in a way that actually prevented us from addressing some of the root causes of real devastation from early on. So for example, large percentages of women, particularly the lowest income women, were those on the front lines in caregiving roles and suffered disproportionately. That was not truly appreciated early on. And I could go on, but just to say there's progress, but we really have not made the progress that needs to be institutionalized in order for us to make the next leap.
Mary Gowdy, I wonder if you would comment on the progress that's been made by women in politics, whether things have improved overall in the political world as compared to, say, 20, 30 years ago.
I think that we were moving forward, we've moved back. If you look at the world itself, it's about 22% of women in politics. If you look at, and Rosie will have an even better figure because they've done more research and Paula, but I worked it out the other day that it's 22% of women in politics if you take over 100 countries. And so in Europe, women have done well, but that's because of the way the political parties select their candidates. And it's all about the selection, how the parties can select candidates, and that's how women can be selected and how women can move to the fore. In other countries, it's slightly different, and it all depends too on who becomes the prime minister or the president, of whether they're prepared to have a 50-50 cabinet, and whether they're willing to give posts to women and for men, and so on. So women have done better in some respects. In Britain, they've gone backwards a bit, but not as backwards as in many other countries. And we have to really make change within the political parties to do this, get the selection, not just about women, but about gender and everything else. It's a whole way of life that has to change to represent everybody.
Nina, in Europe, Angela Merkel seems to have held an extraordinary role certainly on behalf of Germans, but on behalf of Europeans generally. And she's about to step down. Will there be people of the stature of Angela Merkel stepping into that kind of spotlight in Europe?
I'm not, I mean, German politics are not my field, so I wouldn't know. In in France, certainly, it's very funny because the situation is very much like what Mary described, except that we come from further backwards than Britain. Remember, we only got the right to vote in 1947. I think we were the last ones in Europe. Now, we have a few strong women, and certainly when you look at figures, they don't mean all that much because, as Mary said, parties make the lists, and women almost always find themselves in the dummy seat. But if you look at what's really happening in the real country, you see that at least 5 of our major cities now have women mayors. Paris, Marseille, Strasbourg, Lille, strong women. Now, are they, certainly Anne Hidalgo, our mayor, our Paris mayor, is planning on a presidential campaign. Whether that'll work, I don't know.
Rosie, like so many other people, I recently was watching The Crown, and I was reminded that Margaret Thatcher, although she was a very early arrival in a position of power on the world scene and sort of a parallel to Ronald Reagan at the time, that she did not have a single woman in her cabinet for a significant period of time. And as portrayed, at least in this supposedly fictional television series, quite proud of it. She said women just weren't ready. She was there, she was, as it were, one of the boys. How have we come further from that in this period of time?
Yes, absolutely. I have a slightly ambivalent feeling about how to address the legacy of Margaret Thatcher, because I totally adhere to Madeleine Albright's thesis that hell has a special place for women who don't help other women. But on the other hand, she signaled, it had been a long time since Elizabeth I, she signaled that women can lead the UK and actually signaled globally, you know, that women could be very powerful leaders. And women inside the Conservative Party say that after she left office, she actually put in a lot of energy and effort to supporting younger women. She didn't want them in her cabinet when she was in power. But I think some of that was also because of the time, the battle that she would have had to have gone through daily in order to assert herself as a leader. So yeah, I have some hidden sympathy for Margaret Thatcher, but it is different now. You don't. There are many more women in politics in many countries, and you don't need to signal that you won't help other women to extinguish the threat that you pose to men, basically.
You know, in our planning for this forum, when Mike Scott and I were putting it together, I found this video on YouTube with the photographs of 23 women world leaders who were women. And I think, and the title of the video was "The Women Are Coming." And it was quite striking, really, from Namibia to Norway, Bangladesh to, I mean, there have been only women leaders in Bangladesh for quite some time now, as an example. And it can stir an enthusiasm and an excitement that something's really happening, but one wonders whether this is just a flashy way of sensationalizing it or giving people more hope than they ought to have. I don't know. Well,
I think we know, although women leaders tend to be very visible because they're unusual, even though there are that many women leaders now, that's 12% of the total, which is 40% lower than the percentage of women in the adult population in most developed countries. So, you know, it's still women as leaders of countries are really an absolute minority. But I do think over time there is change. And returning to Mary's point, that actually, as countries do have more women in legislatures, which is often due to the deployment of quotas, they create an environment where it is easier for women leaders to come forward. So I do think we're seeing progress. It's just very incremental.
To indulge a little bit more in the history of this, I was also reading recently, being reminded that there were many discoveries, inventions, things done over the years that women were critical in, and men took the credit. The most notorious, or one of the most notorious, and Paul, I'd be interested in your comment on this, is the double helix, the DNA, RNA discoveries. Many prizes were received by James Watson and Francis Crick for their work on it. And it's now become clearer that Rosalind Franklin actually did work that was important, and Crick and Watson couldn't have stood a chance to get the recognition they did without Rosalind Franklin. Could that happen today, Paula?
No, I think that it would be less likely for it to be that flagrant today. I think that was, again, similar to Margaret Thatcher, another era. So we have made progress there. But we also know that there's significant progress still to be made. And what do I mean by that? I co-chaired a couple of years ago the first report on sexual harassment in STEM, sexual harassment of women in academic STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and medicine. And, it was very troubling to see, as we look at numbers and we look at advancement, there's a piece of this that we don't look at, which is where in the pipeline are we losing people? And that is actually quite significant. And we believe that issues such as sexual harassment, which are rampant in academic STEM fields, is one of those reasons. It's not the only reason, but one of those reasons. And the way that STEM, academic STEM, is organized today really leads to, can engender those types of behaviors. So for example, enormous reliance on a single mentor who actually holds the purse strings. And I could go on for the others. The fact that that we started this report 4 years ago, and it was the first evidence-based report on this topic, is quite astounding. And it's made progress, it's made impact, but I think that we still have a long way to go. So again, we're increasing our numbers through that pipeline, but we're still losing a significant number of people, of women. And in particular, there are fallacies about, for example, women of color not experiencing harassment. And we know that they disproportionately experience it. So lots of work still to be done. Although absolutely, we've made progress. And I think the fact that I'm here talking with you today is case in point.
Paula, the university that you've had so much to do with, Harvard, has recently been rocked by scandals involving sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. A very well-regarded faculty member in the government department, for example, has now been discovered to have sexually harassed colleagues and students, graduate students, undergraduate students, for a matter of decades. Not just a few years, but decades, well known, well understood to have been happening. And it's taken more than 20 years for him to be unmasked and for some sort of reaction, official reaction by the university to take place. Harvard's a pretty progressive place. And one can imagine if it's taken that long at Harvard, it's probably taken at least as long many other places as well. Is that getting fixed?
Well, let's just revisit this case, because I think one of the errors we make as we look at issues of sexual harassment is we look at the most egregious offenders as the example. And those people absolutely need to be identified, and I think they are. And when you say was recently discovered, he wasn't recently discovered. There were reports on his behavior over many years. There are a lot of issues around the dispersion of records. And let's face it, women frequently are not believed either, which is a real issue. But I think more importantly in this entire domain, we look to the most egregious offenders as the example. And in our report, we use an iceberg to kind of display this, which is that they are at the pinnacle, right? They are the ones that make it to the news. But in fact, the vast majority of sexual harassment is gender harassment. And what do I mean by that? That is the ambient sense of the put downs, the environment that women experience day in and day out. That goes unexposed. It isn't the egregious singular person. And without addressing those culture issues, we are not going to make progress. Addressing, yes, the pinnacle of harassment is important, but even more important, equally important and greater, because in fact it impacts a much larger percentage of women, is that ambient, or what we call gender harassment. And we like to say, as opposed to the come-ons, it's the put-downs that exist in the environment. And we have found that this is really at epidemic levels, not only in STEM, but quite frankly, in many fields. And so work to do, but at least now we are beginning to understand the scope of the problem.
Nina, how would you compare the sense of progress on these things in Europe at the working level? You're muted, Nina.
Yes, well, we have a parallel scandal to the Harvard one with our École des Sciences Politiques, famous school, which makes up for half our political class. And suddenly it emerges that not only was there harassment, bullying, putting down, obviously, and of course for women my generation, it's amazing that you can even mention it, because I remember when I joined Le Matin newspaper, the editor-in-chief, nice guy, apart from that, would come, walk the aisles while we were typing away, and suddenly he would stop behind one of the girls and grab our breasts. And it was a joke, right? He didn't mean anything harmful. And if you reacted shocked, then you were a loser. You were not one of the gang. And that, this was 1980. So a great deal of way forward. We've done a lot. We've gone a lot forward, but the very fact that girls can come up and speak about it, and of course the social media have a lot to do with that, is such a step forward. It's a million years we have to walk. I'm sorry, my English slips when I'm in Paris. We've got to walk back. I mean, but I think a great deal of progress are being made. I can't help it. I mean, it may be my age, but when I see all these strong girls who don't even think twice, about standing up for their rights against that did not happen, say, 15 years ago. So,
Nina, can I just jump in, because it's interesting. You're right that the ambient climate in terms of speaking out for sure is better. But interestingly, and again, this is only in the US, what we found was that, for example, in academic medicine, up to 50% of women had experienced some form of harassment. And that includes gender harassment. Of course, it's not what we view as that tip of the iceberg. And what we found was that the numbers actually haven't changed over the years, that we're really at some of the same numbers. So there has been some change in, look, we're talking about it there, you know, people are coming forward. But I think what we found was that for all of those who come forward, there are those who don't, or they drop out, or they drop. And those are the silent, the absent women, the lost talent. And when we talk about
good point,
development of talent, you know, those are the people who we don't see.
Mary Gowdy.
How can you
I'm sorry, go ahead, Nina. Yes.
I just wondered, how can you measure whether there's no progress? Because by definition, they were not speaking up.
There are some older data on the rates of harassment, and you're right, the numbers are not outstanding, right? The numbers are not firmly rooted. But what I would say is that although some of the numbers of the most egregious have changed and the speaking out on the most egregious, it's those next layers where there hasn't really been as much progress as we would think there would have been. And what we found in academic medicine, for example, the only institution in the United States that has numbers that surpass it is the military. So, you know, it's really, and some of the other areas were not a whole lot better. We're talking about somewhere, you know, 30% or so. So you're right, the measurement system. And in fact, as we went to do this report, the data were so poor that we had to commission studies, which is for the national academies, we tend to look at evidence that's present. And, you know, case in point, they're really, we couldn't find good evidence. We had to actually go develop it ourselves. So it's, again, we're moving forward, but still culture really must change, and we have a long way to go.
Mary, you have mentioned in conversations that we've had previously another historical example that is very troubling. Joe Cox, a Labour Party member of Parliament, who was murdered. And I wonder what lessons you took from that at the time and how you see that story in retrospect.
The death of Joe Cox was terrible for all of us. And everybody knew Jo because we knew her not only as a member of Parliament, but she was working for Oxfam before that. And she had worked with myself and others in the background, working on policy for future Labour governments and so on. So Jo was a well-known figure and she was trolled. And the reason she was murdered, and it could have happened to any of us and anybody on this panel, was that the trollers are at it, and then other people who are not well are also watching it, who is not their fault. They're not well, they're at home, they're in all sorts of places. And this gentleman was just watching the extremists on the extreme right. And he then ordered, and as you know, in the United Kingdom, you can't carry guns. It's against the law to have a weapon. And he was able to purchase the parts of a gun and put it together. As he did it, I'm not sure mentally did he know who he was going after, but seeing a lot of information about Jo out there, he then went and murdered her when she was going to do her surgery that weekday. So from then onwards, we've then had much more publicity about the kind of trolling that's been happening to women, MPs, and women in business and everywhere else. And so that there's different forms of safeguards for women, and women helped put those safeguards in place themselves, but also as in various parliaments, there's emergency buttons in your room, there's more security, and also people are having security at home and being careful, and it shouldn't be like that. And that's caused partly by social media, but we shouldn't stop social media because that's also part of a way of life now, but we have to take off the black side and all of that of social media. And Jo was killed because of all of that, and she was just picked on in the end by this guy who got a fascination, as they do, and women get fascinations about other people too. You know, it's so I've done some studying, but it was a terrible, the whole thing of trolling against everybody is really bad, and it also stops people doing what they should be doing in terms of campaigning on issues, believing on issues, working on issues, and in some cases makes people just give up and go back into the somewhere. We lose them altogether. And I feel very strongly about that. And coming back to Paula's point, nothing is out without metrics. And it's really important that we keep the metrics on everything, on the good and on the bad. And because otherwise nobody will know whether we're moving forward or backwards. And as we come out of COVID, the metrics are even more important, to get back up to the metrics that we had and get women back up to where they were on boards, whether it's academic boards, whether it's public boards, or in Parliament, and also in the pipeline. And I think one of the things we have to do coming out of this is to look to that. And in Europe, and particularly with one of the organizations I work with quite closely, 30% Club, which I helped found, and working with another organization called Share Action, is we're putting pressure, and I know in America it's happening, and in France to an extent, on the company investors, so that investors are having pressure on them to ensure that a percentage of women, not making it quotas, but that there is a percentage of women on boards and a percentage of ethnic people as well from various backgrounds. And this was beginning to work well and is working. There's still quite a bit about it, but when we come out of COVID, besides getting women back into work, which is vital, also to ensure that we're getting pressure from the investors and other organizations to ensure that women have their place at the table. I'm coming
Rosie,
back.
yes, Rosie, I was just going to ask you to comment on that, please.
Yeah, I run a candidate survey in the UK. I have done since 2005. And it is the case that women candidates, so those seeking for election to the House of Commons, women are more likely to receive threats. They're more likely to receive more violent threats, and they're more likely to be more afraid as a result of those threats. And unfortunately, women from the Black and minority ethnic population are the most likely to receive those threats. So I just thought I would add that.
Absolutely. Very important point, Rosie. We know that, you and I, and we know people who've been counselling quietly to get others to support.
Rosie, what about the role of women in business, for example, internationally? I don't know whether that's within the ambit of the work you do, but Fortune 500 companies, unfortunately it's an American example, there are almost none headed by women. I mean, it's a paltry number.
Yeah, so at the Global Institute, we do look at every sector of work. I'm obviously a political scientist, so I'm talking about my colleagues' research. But just as Paula was describing, really in male-dominated spheres, and STEM is still one of these, we tend to see cultures which are not inclusive. There's some wonderful work about masculinity contests at work and looking at work cultures where actually it's a culture of toxic or hyper-masculinity, which actually makes it very difficult for lots of men to succeed as well as many women. If actually what you're doing is trying to demonstrate that you are individually the best rather than do the best for the company, certain kinds of men tend to do better in those environments than women, and actually more collaborative kinds of men. And I think it's those cultural aspects about some kinds of work, especially at the top of organizations, which is a big barrier. There are other barriers too, but when you get to the top of those organizations, I think that's a huge part. The everyday undermining behavior that Paula described is so important. But it's also about valorizing overwork. It's about a hyper masculinity where you say you don't need sleep. All of these things can make it very unattractive to women and lots of men to pursue that lifestyle. And actually, we know now from health data, going without sleep, you make very bad decisions. It's not a good idea.
I'm sure that's true.
But we have got whole industries that function on the idea that should be valorized. And I think it's a huge problem.
Absolutely.
I wonder if we could get a little bit prescriptive in this part of our discussion. There's often talk about trying to achieve a colorblind society where race does not seem to affect people's advancement in an unfair manner. Are we aiming for a sort of gender blind society? And is that possible? I'm interested in everyone's observations about that. Is it possible in developed countries, in less developed countries, to achieve, if not a gender blind society, at least a more open view of these things so that it's not gender, sex, that's the first thing that people are noticing or that is affecting people's fortunes? I don't know who wants to address that first. Perhaps Rosie, you're the person with the on top of the mountain.
I think we're such a long way from that. I always think that Caroline Credo Perez's book, Invisible Women, is a really great touchstone on this issue, because actually so many areas of our life still operate on the default male. And Paula spoke so eloquently about needing to disaggregate data by gender and ethnicity and other characteristics. We're so far from wanting to progress to gender blind. What we need now is to make people's different lived experiences visible, and for decision makers to be trying to raise those experiences in their policy making. So I'd love to think one day it might be possible, but what I would be campaigning right now is quite the opposite, and it's making our differences visible so we can make better policy.
Paula?
Rosie, I couldn't agree with you more. I've spent a good part of my career in academic medicine really studying sex differences in health and disease. And part of the problem was that a person's gender was actually not thought about. And so you're right, the default was male, which leads to bad science. And so in my mind, it isn't as much about being gender blind or race blind, which I actually don't think is the optimal state. I think it is embracing the contributions and the talents of people in a very equitable fashion, in a way that does not make preconceived notions about their abilities. And if we strive towards a quote unquote race blind or gender blind, I fear that it really moves us away from the hard work that we need to do. We are people who are rooted in history. We are a part of our history, and being able to have that embraced. We call it inclusive excellence, which is this notion of inclusion, of recognizing and embracing difference as being a critical aspect of excellence. You cannot have excellence without it. And so how do we get to that point?
Nina?
I think gender blindness is a horrible hypothesis.
I think we can put that one away, but please go ahead.
But I think that the main progress that's being made is within people's heads, and not being young. I mean, being an old woman, I can see the road that's being traveled. All right, women are still being discriminated against, but before that, they were not even seen as thinking persons. So to have a fight with your boss because you're a woman and you want same salary as we don't get it. In France, it's amazing. The gap between a man and a woman's salary is awful. But to address that question directly, the way I'm impressed by Rosie, she's the epitome of the progress that has been done since I was in the working force, because we were afraid of speaking up because we could feel that male chauvinists were in fact afraid of us. Do you understand that? It's very strong. To me, if I look at the future, a balanced society is a society where everybody has the same weight in their voice and that the other side doesn't feel threatened, so that we don't get to situation like what happened like those people who invested the Capitol the other day, invaded the Capitol. Those are terrified people in my mind. And I think you could draw a parallel on the war of sexes. I think progress is being made, to sum it up, but it's not, there's a long way to go, certainly.
Can I just come in for a second?
Please, Mary.
I think progress was being made. The pandemic has put everybody back. So we have to ensure, as we come out of the pandemic, that we don't let anything go. And all of us are in positions to ensure that nothing goes, because we have a voice. And it's for us to use our power with everyone else's power. Because if we all work together, men and women, we can make this change. And I think it's absolutely vital not to accept being on the back foot. And I've been reading too many op-eds and other articles about us being on the back foot. And we have to continue today as we are working from home. And we're going to be working from home for a long time in different ways. So we have to ensure that there's respect for those who are working from home and their places at the table, although here there may be a few people in, and that women in the same way. And we also have to push that the pipeline is still continuing to be as it should be, and that people have the opportunity for mentoring and sponsorship. And it's going to be different. But all the issues that Rosie and Paula and Nina, you've helped to put in place over the last 10 years, we have to ensure that they are in place and putting in further issues at the table, including, because of climate change, we're going to have more displaced people. So we have to ensure that they get their place and their children get their place, that they're not at the bad school, that they're there where they're going to be able to thrive. And also that we have women at the peace table in the same way in the military. And we must also make time for lesbians, gays, and transgender people, because again, they're becoming the backlash of people taking it out on them, saying, oh, they don't matter when they go to the hospital or wherever. So especially as people are known. So we have to move forward to have a better situation for all of us coming out of this pandemic, but in particular for women, of course. But you know, I feel we mustn't allow us to be pushed back. You know, we've just got to, and we've got to bring up the women who've let themselves be pushed and weighed down, because I understand what homeschooling's like. I understand what it's like working 24/7 all day and all night, and we do need sleep. And I just like us to work, take ourselves forward, how we move forward. And I know that Nina, because of your writing, and Rosie, because of the convenings and other convenings that I get involved in, and Paula, that we try to keep our issues with new issues on every agenda. So it may be about something else, but we put this on the agenda. Do you see where I'm trying to come from? You know,
I do. I'm going to ask Mike now if he would like to curate some of the questions that have come in from our participants, I think around the world, and we'll continue our discussion, all of us together, with Mike telling us what the questions are.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for a great debate so far. There's a question just come in from Carol Salas Arvalo. Most recently, our US most powerful woman legislator, Lynn Cheney, daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, was censured for voting for the conviction of former President Donald Trump for inciting the riots held at our US Capitol. How would women leaders in your respective countries feel? So I got to just find that. How would women in your respective countries feel about this issue?
Just one technical correction. Liz Cheney voted for the impeachment, but was in the House not in a position to vote for conviction in the Senate. But the point remains that she was one of the few Republicans in the House to vote against her former president.
Are there any comments on that, Paula?
You said in your respective countries, but I'm here. So look, this has been a devastating time in the United States. I think it's pretty clear that what we have lived through with regard to the culmination of the insurrection has been devastating to so many, to women, to people of color, to immigrants, and I could go on, and to sexual minorities, et cetera. I think that we have a real issue around the separation or the ability to focus on values and what is it that we stand for as a country versus partisan politics, and what partisan politics has come to mean, which in some areas becomes value void. And we have a reckoning right now. And I think that reckoning has been accelerated by the other movements in the United States around Black Lives Matter, which really is not only about Black lives, but about those who have less of a voice and who have experienced abuse in many ways over time. But there is a real reckoning right now. And, you know, we are grappling with this. I think we still have we still have to find our way. And we hope that bringing this administration in the way that it has begun its work will bring us back to some level of decency, back to some level of what is in the common good, and how do we move together with at least the values that we espouse. So I'll just end there.
I think that's a great answer to the question, if I may say so. Marlena Brannan says, what kinds of issues make more progress when women have a voice in politics? Mary, do you want to have a go at that one? You're muted, Mary, yeah?
Sorry. I think that when women have power in politics, if you look where women are dealing with financial matters, and you look at a feminist, if you would like to put it in that way, economic policy, you see better decision making in finance, as we've seen in various countries around the world. Also, when you see women involved in peace policies as defense ministers, they sit down and they ensure that the local women are at the peace table and ensure that the discussions go on for as long as they should go on, and that education, health and housing are taken into consideration and not have to be dealt with in 2 hours, so the boys can go off and say we've got the peace and the peace is broken 2 days later. And also on the questions of what happened in America, which could have easily happened in all of our countries. We had some bad demonstrations just a little while ago, but we were able to bring those back. But also it's men and women working together to make that happen in politics. And we're lucky in Europe, I think more so than in America, that more women are at the peace table. And we've also seen with women in very senior places where they have made the change. At the UN, at the Security Council, we have the Irish ambassador, we have the British ambassador, both women who hold a pen on trying to make peace around the more difficult issues. So I think where women are in senior positions and when they work together and bring men with them, we don't want to do this on our own, we want to all work together, you can see where there is a difference. Because it's not macho. Also, they reach out to bring in those who've got the expertise to assist, you know. But just coming on to the one thing about the gender pay gap, that is an issue that we have to all work together again to get back. And also, I was really upset recently when I found out medically that it's that women doctors at every level get paid 22% less than men in Europe and other places, and that really I found shocking, because I thought that would be one profession where they're at least on a par, you know. Sorry to bring that up, but I do feel quite strongly about it. I'm sure, Paula, you were shocked when you found that out yourself when you were working.
We should
Any
also...
comment, Paula? Sorry, Nina, carry on.
I just wanted to point out that dealing with the pandemic, as was reported several times, has been much better in countries led by women. Of course, with New Zealand being the champion of them all. Denmark, Germany, up until the second lockdown. but generally, I think this is what's changing mind. And I noticed that in France, the local level has more and more and more women in official positions, because women are good at being concrete. And I think this is an idea that's making its way in people's minds. I think the pandemic is an extremely good example. The countries led by women did better than the others, not to speak of the US, of course, or Brazil.
Well, I have to say at Oxford, we're very proud of Professor Sarah Gilbert, who was working so hard on the vaccine, but I don't think she's had as much exposure as other people, you know, and her work, I think needs to be triumphed and trumpeted about a lot more. I wonder whether, Rosie, did you want to say something?
Well, I can do. Actually, it comes back to the previous question about Lynn Cheney, is that, I mean, I'm not an expert on this. Of course, there's Lynn Cheney, but there's also Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, women are not exempt from poor behaviour. And I think there's a danger that there's a justice argument for having more women in politics or in any leadership position, that we just have a right to be there. And we shouldn't necessarily expect women to behave differently when they get there. But I think because of socialization processes and expectations of girls' behavior, we are socialized to behave in a slightly more collective and empathetic way. And I actually think if you look at that research, I mean, there have been a couple of studies now showing that at least in terms of deaths, countries that have been led by women have had lower numbers of deaths. But I think really it's that what that's been driven is by the outliers, the hyper masculinity, by Bolsonaro, by Trump, by these really hyper masculine leaders, where actually it's a very destructive leadership style where you can't speak truth to power, etc. And I think we're focusing on the women because they're visible and there are a small number of them. But the real problem is this toxic masculinity.
Mike, if I may intercede for just a second on the Cheney example is a very interesting one, and I don't mean in any way to suggest she shouldn't have been recognized for showing a certain amount of courage in her role. But if her name had not been Cheney, if she were not the daughter of a famously powerful vice president, Dick Cheney, I don't think she would have had the same attention. And that, I think, comes back to reinforcing the basic point. Yeah. The daughter of this powerful man dared to be a rebel.
Can I just add one last comment to this question about what went on here and where we're going? And that is that we know that when women, and this is a generalization, Rosie, and I recognize that, but on average, when women have positions of leadership, there is more investment in the social sector, in those foundational areas that are required to combat inequality and to address these major issues, which are so foundational to an effective democracy. And I think the trouble we have here is that the inequality that we've seen, which women are in many ways more apt to experience, but it's a problem across the board. This growing inequality is really a fundamental threat to the future of democracy in the United States. And so as we think about how do we turn the corner, I do think that this very large, complex issue is going to be one that must be at the root of us moving forward.
Angela Preston, thank you for that, Paula. Angela Preston, hello, Angela. Angela is a regular contributor to us. She says, would it help to have more courses on women at universities or more courses on women at university? There is only one course in government at Georgetown. There is no courses in the search at University of Oxford of the undergraduate courses. So should there be more courses on women in the universities? Rosie?
More courses on gender equality, I think. I think actually there's an appetite amongst millennial young men for changing gender relations. You know, many young men would like to have a work-life balance where they can, for example, spend more time with their children. Lots, as we've discussed already in this conversation, when you've got toxic masculinity, that affects a lot of men as well as women. So I think this is a conversation to be had, and it's a really important one, and it's so important that men are in those classrooms as well. But with those caveats, yes, please. We've got them at King's if you're interested.
And can I just add there that courses are what I would say is how do we, in a very intersectional way, include a gender perspective. I think it's what Mary had focused on around convenings, et cetera, whatever the topic, that you think about those perspectives. But I want to say the flip side of this is that, quite frankly, we need larger numbers of women on our faculty. And I think that when you have more diversity, whatever that diversity is on your faculty, by that very nature, courses seem to shift, and the ability then of students to see themselves as those who can go that next step is phenomenal. I mean, I think that that is really critical. You know, as a college for women, premier college for women, you know, over 50% of our faculty are women in some of the most male-dominated fields, you know, economics, computer science, physical sciences, philosophy. And those are areas where we see our young women flocking to. They are our most populous majors, and they go on in those fields. Now, why is that? It's because they can see themselves. First of all, the context in which they're learning is different, and they can see themselves in those fields. So representation is absolutely essential.
Thank you. I think absolutely agree on all of that. I'm going to go on to another area, which Angela Preston has mentioned, and also Marianne, who hasn't given her surname, has mentioned. Angela says the development of technology is detrimental to girls. 78% of victims of online child sexual exploitation are girls. What can we do about this? And Marianne says, do you think the fact that young boys' men are exposed to hard porn uncensored on the internet has made gender and sexual harassment of young women girls worse and gives them a feeling of entitlement to harass and mistreat women? Mary, do you want to have a go at this one?
I mean, I think that is true. There is something by seeing that, but also I'm very much in favor of taking this sort of material off the internet. You know, that I feel that it shouldn't be allowed, but it does give people some form of entitlement. And I just find it horrific. And I also am more horrified that sometimes fathers and mothers don't object to their children seeing or watching that kind of material. To me, it's just awful. And I think this is something that we should be working on to eliminate. I mean, they're also, that's not saying you don't object to sexual activities in some films or something. You know, we've seen it as people have been talking about The Crown and all sorts of others, big series that we're all seeing just now. But, you know, that's different from hard porn and sexual abuse on the screen in this way. And I just think it's just awful.
Nina, how about you? And what's your response to this?
Well, I'm in two minds about this because I think it's impossible to curb it. I mean, the internet is ungovernable, as we know, at this point in time. I don't know, maybe in 20 years' time, it'll be different. I also notice that we are subjected, we collectively, not just the young men, to scenes that just 20 years ago would have been unimaginable, whether it be journalists being beheaded in Iraq or just simply the crime series that you see with those, what do you call them, pathologists, legal pathologist, I forget the name, forensic, you know, showing us all those. This is the society we are living in. And so I think that hard porn, it's just only part of that. But I do think that whilst the image of woman is progressing in terms of a woman's capacity to lead, to do things, to speak, there's an undercurrent, and I'm much less optimistic there. There's an undercurrent of hardcore sexism, but as bred in cultures where women are nothing, which is sort of slowly coming up through fashion. I mean, look at the things that some of the girls wear today. That, I mean, when I see some of the shoes that girls, my generation, fought like hell to stop shaving our legs, wearing very high heels. All that has come back. So, and, you know, we did make way. We did really make progress. Now there's been a shifting of the way people look at it. But yes, it would be interesting to work on that. But I don't think very much can be done on the internet itself. It's going to show horrors. It's going to be used by mad people, and there's not much that we can do there. The work has to be done inside, you know, prior to the images.
Thank you both for those comments. Again, not very hopeful, obviously, about the internet, but this is a big issue, I think, that we have. Tony Eade says, has the panel any comments or suggestions on how teachers should work with boys and young men, given their comments on hypermasculinity, for instance, in terms of competitiveness? Rosie.
Absolutely. I think that actually relates to the previous point too. I mean, I agree with Mary that I would like to see social media platforms treated as publishers and some of this material to be much harder to stumble across. But at the same time, I agree with Nina that it's not going to disappear. And so that the way to deal with these things is largely through education and educating young people, girls and boys, men and women, around sexual relationships and respect. And so that's an absolutely massive issue. And I think in terms of young boys, I actually think that toxic masculinity only ever benefits a very small minority of men. And actually, if we educate young boys to understand that they don't have to perform to stereotypes, that's going to be liberating for a lot of young boys. And I think fostering collaboration as well as competition is a huge part of doing that. It takes us back to the discussion of Rosalind Franklin. You don't have to, you can be a collective in science and share your glory. You don't have to be the only one. And I think that that's the message that we need to share with our young people.
Thank you for that, Rosie. We're coming towards the end, but Paul Williams asks a very pertinent question here, I think. Is there a focus within this issue on women in higher socio-economic groups as opposed to women in lower SEGs, let alone those outside the Western world? And if this is so, is this something that should be addressed? I would just add to this. Maggie and I support a group called Street Talk in King's Cross. And Street Talk's run by clinical psychotherapists, and it looks after the women who have no voice whatsoever. These are women who have been trafficked, brought into the country by these evil people, and then they're put out to prostitution, drugs, and so on. When they're arrested, they have no papers, they've got nowhere to go, they have no names because they've been given other names. And the justice system just puts them into prison until they come out and the traffickers pick them up again. And these psychotherapists have given up huge jobs, very wealthy jobs, to try and look after them in the welfare centres. It's these women as well that we mustn't forget, and I think that Paul is also referring to. Rosie, you look very upset about that, so perhaps you want to, yeah.
Well, it's horrific, isn't it? And I do think that, I mean, if our conversations seem to focus on wealthier women, that's unfortunate because that wasn't the intention. These issues, particularly around COVID-19, are having an impact all around the world. And we see reports from the UN that young girls in Africa are, the rate of child marriage is increasing and girls leaving education is increasing. These are all moving in a positive direction until now. The same if we look at who's borne the economic impact in developed countries, it's women who are on 0 hours contracts, women in precarious work. So if the sense has been that we have been focusing on the elite, I apologise, that was not the intention.
No, I don't think it is. I think it was set up for to talk about women in leadership, but I think it was a good point for Paul to raise right at the end, that we don't forget that element. And we don't forget those women either, you know, in what has been a really wonderful kind of a discussion today. Michael, I'm going to have to bring it to.
Can I just add one thing to what Rosie said? Because I totally agree that this was not meant to only focus on the quote unquote elite. And I think there are examples around the world of women organizing for change and making change in very powerful ways. I look at some of the results of our last election and what happened in terms of women of color organizing across socioeconomic status over time to essentially make a real foundational change in the direction of politics. And I think you could look in every country and see women on the ground who have organized. And I think the question becomes, how is there a more collective, integrated coming together in terms of that movement forward?
Thanks, Paula. Sandy, could I give you the last word before I close up?
Well, just a few comments quickly, Mike. We're tight. I want to thank everybody, thank all our panelists who really built this into a marvelous discussion. And I think that we'll have lots of feedback from our participants out around the country and the world saying how catalytic this discussion was and some of the important subjects introduced. Just very briefly, some coming programs. March 11th, this collaboration between Blackfriars Hall at Oxford and the Free Speech Project at Georgetown. We'll have our next program on academic freedom around the world. And it will, I think, have some interest, include 2 Russian academics, as well as others, one from the United States and one from the UK. In terms of the Free Speech Project itself, we will actually, I don't have a date yet, but our next Free Speech Project forum at Georgetown will be about the regulation of social media and whether that is inevitable. Some of you touched on those issues saying, and who's going to do the deed? Who's going to take the first steps? Will it be private regulation or public regulation, both in this country and around the world? Thanks to you, Mike, for our great collaboration, and to all the people at Georgetown, Yvonne Queck, Kevin Pollack, Paula Johnson, the other people who've helped us do what we need to do. And back to you, Mike, to close us out.
Well, yes, thank you very much. And thank you all, Rosie, Nina, Paula, Mary. It's a great talk. Sorry I couldn't get one final word from each of you, but you really contributed throughout and have given a very thoughtful program for us today. I thank President Jack DeJoya and Vice President Tom Banchoff and Dean for Georgetown College, Soyika Gilbert, for backing these programs. And I thank at Blackfriars Hall, John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, and King Garona Gavnai, our UK Administrator, for backing us as well. Yvonne Queck, Kevin, Pollack, thank you also for the help you've given today on this. But may I thank most of all everyone who's given in questions today. It's been a terrific response to this title. Like Sandy said, we're very excited that we've actually invited 2 Russian academics to come on 11th of March to talk about academic freedom. I think that's going to be a great program as well, just like this one. It's Alexander Chernikov and Natalia Truvanova. They're both from the Bauman Technical University in Moscow. I think actually they're very courageous to do this, and I think it's going to be great. So please tune in for that. The next literature one on the Christian literary imagination is the 23rd of February at 4 p.m. and will feature Professor Mark Bosco of Georgetown University speaking on Flannery O'Connor, and he will be joined by Joseph Simmons from Campion Hall in Oxford. It's a treat not to be missed. Thank you all for participating. I'm Michael Scott. I'm Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Off. Until the next time, take care, keep safe. Thanks again. Goodbye.